Thanks for coming to this meeting entitled What is to be Done. If you don't know, it's a title of a famous Lenin pamphlet from the early 1900s talking about the political situation in Russia. We thought it was a good title for a meeting after the referendum to kind of gather our thoughts and discuss what we need to do as communists in Britain in this situation. The position that we took as the RCG on the referendum was that we argued for a boycott. We didn't support either side in the referendum. We recognised that this was a political battle between two sections of the ruling class over the future of British imperialism, and that kind of coloured the debate at every level, whether it was talking about the so-called freedom of movement of the EU and either dismantling or protecting that, or the benefits to the City of London of being in and out of the EU. The whole of the debate was couched in terms of what was best for Britain, i.e. best for British capitalism. It seems like an understatement at the moment to say that we're living in a period of crisis, and this is something that the RCG has argued for many years. Every political and economic development of the last few decades has to be seen in light of the fact that British capital is in the depths of an economic crisis. The war on Iraq, which we've seen, the inquiry results produced today, the war on Iraq expressed this economic crisis of imperialism. The financial crashes of the so-called East Asian tiger economies, the debt crisis in Latin America, the dot-com crash, the Lehman Brothers and subprime mortgage crisis, the collapse of Northern Rock, and now the threat of a further catastrophe with Brexit, all express the instability and unsustainability of capitalism. With austerity, the war on the peoples of the Middle East was brought home. Cutbacks across working class communities from the north right down to the south, private financed initiatives in NHS and schools, further restrictions on already restrictive and racist systems governing migration, rising poverty, job insecurity and homelessness. With Brexit, the economic crisis has spilled over into a political crisis for the ruling class. We argued over 20 years ago that British imperialism faced a choice in order to survive: ally itself to the EU, a union of imperialist states, or rely on the military might of the US. Now, with the two main parties in political crisis, the future that they've debated long and hard over is disintegrating. So the way this meeting is going to work, Will is going to introduce the main political issues, and after that there'll be plenty of time for open debate and discussion. There's no question can't be asked, there's no disagreement that we can't have as comrades in the room. I'd just say that if you want to speak in the discussion, just put your hand up and I'll make a note, make sure everyone who wants to speak gets to speak. The toilets are just behind me this way if you need to go, and please turn your phones on silent or off just so we don't get interrupted. Just pass over to Comrade Will.
Alright, thanks Comrade. It's kind of hard to know where to begin with the events of the last 2 weeks, I feel. Lewis nicked one of my lines about what is to be done. So, you know, that was a title by Lenin we're using as a tagline for tonight's discussion, but I do think there's another thing that he said that really does seem up to date for the events of the last week or two. He said something like, there are decades where nothing happens, but there are weeks when decades happen. And I really think that is pretty up to date. We've seen a whole generation of Tory politicians have their careers effectively ended. We've seen the Labour Party head towards a rerun of the 1980s SDP split. We've seen the end of the UK as a single political entity becoming almost certain. We've even seen unionists in the occupied 6 counties raise the prospect of Irish reunification. It's a lot to take in. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has felt rather overwhelmed by this. Indeed, I don't really think it's too much of an exaggeration to describe this as the most significant political development in Europe since the breakup of the socialist bloc in the late 80s. So what began as an internecine struggle between the ruling class of Britain has brought to the fore antagonisms not just across the UK but across the entire continent of Europe. The far right across the EU, so for instance the Front National in France, Dutch Freedom Party, the AFD in Germany, just for 3 examples, they've all hailed Brexit as a victory for ordinary people against, faceless bureaucrats, as they put it. Whilst in the UK, the most reactionary elements of the press and mainstream politics have been similarly exuberant. Farage, in particular, made a statement in the early morning after the vote, claiming the Leave campaign had won without firing a shot. And this is empirically false. I mean, let's not forget, as many seem to have, that a nominally pro-immigration MP was murdered by a fascist during the referendum campaign. This is really a consequence of the racist, reactionary rhetoric that has been propagated by the ruling class and the propaganda arm in the British press for a long time now. It seems clear that the leading figures in the Leave campaign didn't actually expect to win the vote. This is borne out by both the speed in which promises made on public spending, immigration controls have been reneged upon, and subsequent hand-washing by the likes of Farage and Boris Johnson. Consider the following 2 statements from Boris Johnson. So we've got May the 23rd, Johnson on Twitter. If you vote in on June the 23rd, you are kissing goodbye permanently to control of immigration. Boris Johnson on 26th of June, so just over a month later, it is said that those who voted Leave were mainly driven by anxieties about immigration. I do not believe this is so. So this, to my mind, is pretty telling. Even more so when you factor in the assertion that there's no rush to trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, an assertion that the European ruling class, I think, are going to take issue with. Again, it seems clear that this ref was born of 2 things. An internal struggle within the ruling class and the Tory party on how best to safeguard their interests going forward, and an attempt to staunch the hemorrhage of support in the country over to UKIP. However, things within the Tory party have quickly descended into a bloodbath. The Brexit camp collapsed almost overnight under revelations there was no plan at all to do what to do in the event of victory. We had a Leave staffer on Sky News claiming the campaign expected that Number 10 should have implemented the plan. Cameron's resigned, passing a book from a referendum that he called from a crisis of his making onto his successor. Quite who this will be is kind of unclear right now. So Johnson, long the heir presumptive, was knifed in the back by Michael Gove, who was his former ally, who was going to be his campaign chief. And this is a low blow even for the Tory party with everything that implies. Johnson was reportedly ashen-faced and disconsolate upon receipt of this news, which is some small gratification at least. Gove appears to be pitching himself as an anti-Cameron, so he said, whatever charisma is, I do not have it. I think we can all agree he's right on that. Joking aside though, this is a man who is utterly detested by most of the country, most of his party. I'm sure my comrade would be able to tell you what teachers around the country think of it. Apart from Mr Farage, who prior to the 2015 general election described him as a strong and principled man who he would do business with and form a coalition with if he was leader of the Tory party. What are the other candidates? Liam Fox is gone. Stephen Crabb, a man who thinks that LGBTQ people can be cured, is gone. Throwing his support around Theresa May, probably in the hope of a cabinet position. Theresa May does deserve a little more scrutiny though, because it does look at this point that she's going to be the next Prime Minister of the country. Now, this is a politician under whose aegis the UK deported 1 person every 8 minutes during the years 2010-2015. Great many of whom faced torture and persecution upon repatriation. May was nominally part of the Remain camp, but at the same time she's advocated withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights. And in the aftermath of Italy's ending of the Mare Nostrum search and rescue operation, which if you don't know, was an operation patrolling the Mediterranean to try and pick up people that were pick up refugees that come off boats or that kind of thing. So this was scrapped, and May, in the aftermath of this, argued that no replacement should be put into place. This is effectively arguing in favour of allowing thousands of desperate people, thousands of desperate refugees to drown, to the next Prime Minister of the UK. It's clear that whoever emerges from this, like this nest of vipers as leader, the Tories will be even more reactionary, even more racist, even more committed to furthering the interests of British imperialism at the expense of the working classes, not just in Britain, but around the world. Not to be outdone, the Labour Party, instead of taking advantage of a completely divided and essentially leaderless government, the Labour Party has launched into a civil war of its own. This will go down in history as one of the most blindly self-serving actions committed by a party whose history is littered with such. Possibly the most inept coup ever witnessed was launched against Corbyn's leadership in the immediate aftermath of the vote. It was framed as being motivated by the failure of Corbyn to secure a Remain vote. Now, we're no fans of the Labour Party, but just for some clarity here, Corbyn achieved the same margin of Remain votes amongst Labour voters as the SNP's Nicola Sturgeon did. So this framing it's an artefact. Like, this was obviously prepared a long time before. It then morphed to this familiar refrain about Corbyn's supposed inelectability. I don't know if that is a word. If not, I've just invented it. What this attempted putsch is really about is the majority of the parliamentary Labour Party and their own privileges. Corbyn is deemed to not be racist enough, to not be reactionary enough, to not be committed to reinforcing Britain's racist borders in order for this cabal of MPs to secure their own seats at the next election, whether that's in this year or more likely in 2020. These people are hell-bent on preserving the status quo and will go against the vast majority of their membership and the country to do so. At the very moment when a great many working class people, and by working class people, I mean the whole of the working class, not this conception the media are fixated on. These people, great amounts of people, I'm sure most people in this room as well, fearing for their rights, their livelihoods, their futures, everything. And the Labour Party has abandoned them in order to protect the status of a tiny number of people. This is an utterly unforgivable act in my mind, and it does show what a reactionary party Labour is. So at this moment it seems Corbyn and the membership on the one side and the PLP on the other have reached a sort of impasse. Corbyn won't step down, the PLP won't back him. Given that Corbyn seems to lack the political will to push for deselection of these MPs, it's hard to see how the Labour Party can continue in its current form. A split seems the most likely outcome. Whatever the outcome, it seems clear that the Labour Party is in no position to offer any resistance to the government at all, even if it wanted to. So turning to the wider situation around the world, things are beginning to look, well, sort of disastrous is the only word I can really think of how to describe it. The pound's fallen to its lowest against other major currencies for over 30 years. Billions have been wiped off stock markets across the globe. The European stock market suffered a bigger crash than 1987's Black Monday. £85 billion was wiped off, the value of the FTSE 100 and 250 in one day alone. Banking, house building stocks were particularly badly hit. What's also suffered is Britain's standing amongst the imperialist powers. We have, the RCG in the past, described Britain as the weak link in the capitalist chain. The UK, with 6 times its GDP invested overseas, is uniquely vulnerable to financial shocks. Now it will be seen not just as a weak link, but as a parvenu, basically a better Imar. The ruling classes of the other major imperialist powers must be fairly incredulous that British ruling class let a major piece of foreign and economic policy be decided by a popular referendum. We're already hearing rumblings from Brussels that this divorce is going to be a painful one for Britain. This is in part to insulate themselves from the crisis and also to head off the far right in their own respective countries. Making an example for Britain will serve as a warning to Eurosceptics across the EU. seems fairly crucial for Britain's economy, and I think it's telling this has been one of the major debating points in the mainstream press, that Britain retains access to the single market. 40% of British exports are to the EU. This will come with the caveat of retaining freedom of movement, however, and this is a measure that would whip up a storm of opposition in the reactionary elements of society that the referendum has unleashed. Some people have latched onto this, onto the fact that the vote is not a legally binding thing on Parliament as a way out of what is perceived as a mess, calling for Parliament to either reject the vote or for a second referendum or another referendum and another one until they get the right result. This would not only be electoral disaster for both the Conservatives and Labour, but it holds a very real threat of sowing the seeds of a large far-right street movement, and I really don't think I need to point out the dangers of one of those growing up. Finally, I want to address the real quandary that we're facing here, and that's the position of the working classes. There's been a concerted effort to portray the Leave vote as a revolt by the working classes against the elite. To my mind, this rests upon a complete misconception of the working class and its constitution. The working class is not a homogeneous block, It's made up of different stratums of people. Yeah, there's white British people, but we've got second and third generation immigrants from former colonies, BME British people, more recent immigrants from the former socialist countries, and so on. So to characterise the working class in the way that the media is doing is just completely wrong. Many of the inhabitants of former industrial areas that voted overwhelmingly to leave do have legitimate grievances against the ruling class that has destroyed their communities in order to invest in overseas countries where it is more profitable. The former shipbuilding areas in the North East, the old mill towns of Lancashire, the former mining towns of Wales and Yorkshire. These communities have been decimated by years of privatisation, industrial decline, and more recently austerity. But this is in no way anything to do with immigration at all. And to even concede 1 inch to this argument, so when you hear these refrains from Labour Party politicians that we need to listen to concerns about immigration, to even concede that is tantamount to furthering the spread of racism in society. We have to give no quarter to that opinion at all. I'm not absolving people of responsibility for bigotry, but I believe the lack of a coherent and organised left narrative that our common enemy is the imperialist system and its deployment of racism has allowed the two main political parties and the reactionary press to pour racist rhetoric into people's heads for decades. Every problem is met by the same answer. Can't find work? Immigrants. Can't buy a house? Immigrants. House prices fall? Immigrants. NHS collapsing due to crippling PFI debt? Immigrants. So on, so on, so on. I'm sure everyone is sick to death of hearing it. In the face of an emboldened far right and an upsurge in racist attacks, one NGO has reported a 540% rise in these incidents within 2 weeks. The police figure is something to about 50%, but whatever, there has been a huge upsurge. The need to organise and to agitate against this prevailing narrative is more urgent than ever. Attacks on workers' rights will continue, public services will continue to be gutted, deportations will increase, the housing crisis, which in Manchester I'm sure you're aware of, is already snowballing out of control, it will worsen. Just a note to address the so-called Brexit. I didn't want to talk too much about the arguments beforehand. I think this is something that does need to be going over. Capital, as my comrade said, has been in crisis for 30 years now, at least. It's not enough to wait for it to worsen. I mean, after all, the crisis of capitalism is not immediately going to result in socialism. If that's all that's needed, which seems to have been the Brexit argument, it will be a blow to capitalism, and then what? Why are we still here? Where was the socialist revolution in 2008, or 93, or 1987, or 1973? It's not enough for capital to be stricken with crisis. Strong, organised communist opposition to it is needed. Every right, every concession, everything the working classes have ever won from the ruling elite has been won by action. We can't wait for a Labour Party with a record that is every bit as bad as the Tories historically to maybe get elected in 4 years and, you know, maybe enact some weak social democratic reforms. If we want to defend what we have, if we want to fight for a better world for all, not just a privileged stratum of society, everybody, we have to organise and we have to fight back and we have to do it now. We can take inspiration from movements like, for instance, the Focus C15 Mothers, the anti-raids networks in London, other extra parliamentary campaigns. All these have fought back against austerity and racism, and all these they've all made some gains, which is better than nothing. Work ahead is going to be hard, it's going to be dirty, and it's going to be intimidating, but we've got no choice but to undertake it. Thank you.